thought we could start with what you don't actually like or what you're critiquing in the book, and this is a common denominator in all your work, in How We Became Posthuman and your 2017 book Unthought. This critique of liberalism, in some way you're trying to critique the idea of modern subjectivity, you're critiquing anthropocentrism, and you're trying to rethink the idea of cognition. You're trying to decenter the human being and have a more expansive understanding of cognition, right? So I think it's a very, is it anti-modern? I suppose it's kind of an anti-modern project. If you think of, like, say, someone like Francis Bacon, that's sort of the idea that nature is something that has to be dominated and it's something we have only an instrumental relationship with. So I thought perhaps I'd let you explain what your critique of liberalism is.
Well, thank you, Patrick. And you actually gave a very good summary there, that the main topic that I'm focused on here is anthropocentrism and ways to overcome it. And central to my approach is, as you mentioned, broadening the idea of cognition to include all living creatures and AI and computational media as well. And why cognition, one might ask? Well, we humans like to think of ourselves as the apex species on the earth, but if you think about it, we're not the strongest, we're not the fastest, we're not the most agile, but we can build machines that are faster than cheetahs, stronger than elephants, and so forth. And what lets us build those machines, we figure, is our cognitive powers. So if you want to decenter the idea of human superiority, the very first place you would look is cognition. So in my book Unthought, which I think you mentioned previously, I made the argument that for humans, consciousness is only a small part of cognition, that a much larger part of cognition is what I call non-conscious cognition, not to be confused with unconsciousness. Non-consciousness operates below consciousness, and it is the first repository for sensory data coming in. So non-conscious cognition screens this data, filters it, responds to it, and forwards some of it to consciousness. But without that filter of non-conscious cognition, consciousness couldn't operate. It's not equipped to handle the onslaught of sensory information coming into our bodies every second of the day. So it's a fair guess that non-conscious cognition developed first. So if you agree that we're going to uncouple consciousness and cognition and make consciousness a small part of cognition, then that opens the playing field to consider other forms of non-conscious cognition in creatures that do not have consciousness, such as plants, such as microorganisms, and so forth. So that move to uncouple cognition and consciousness was a crucial first step. And I worked that argument out in my book, Unthought. So in a certain way of thinking, Bacteria to AI is a sequel to that book. So it goes more deeply into the issues of cognition, what it would mean, for example, to claim that all living creatures have cognitive capabilities. Then in further work that I've done since that book has been published, I'm focused on identifying criteria for cognition, specifying what those 5 criteria are, and then examining the minimally cognitive cases of plants and microorganisms in particular. So all of this is really a kind of integrated project to think about how we can realign our relationship both to other living creatures on the earth and to the synthetic intelligences that we're now creating at a very fast pace.
So I think just staying with the Unthought book before we get to the book I asked to talk to you about, but because I think what's really great about the Unthought book is that you got really sort of clear examples in it. So I think, and I'm probably going to mangle this, but one of the examples you use in that is of the traffic system in California or Los Angeles, I think, which was it ATSAC or something like that? I can't quite remember the acronym.
That's right. That's right. It's a traffic control center that controls all of the stoplights in Los Angeles. And I paid a visit to that center, and I was fascinated by their software and how their software executes what I would call cognitive tasks. But of course, that's all done in coordination with humans, both in developing the software and then overseeing it. So they're constantly tinkering with the software, changing it to adapt to current conditions and so forth. But it's a good example of how you set up a central information control center that has both synthetic and human intelligences at work in it. And of course, traffic is a huge topic in Los Angeles. People always talk about the traffic because it's incessant. And so people live their lives according to traffic patterns here. So it's a big topic and a crucial part of the infrastructure.
Well, it is because it is the environment itself, isn't it? Piece of thing, which is your point rather. It's like the weather traffic in Los Angeles, I would imagine.
Not the weather, omnipresent.
You got a couple of seasons. You got like winter, summer, and traffic. Yeah. But in the move to the so your most recent book, From Bacteria to AI, you're offering a theory of not quite a theory of consciousness.
Quite the opposite. I'm make that correction. Theory of consciousness, since my whole point is that cognition is so much broader than consciousness.
Yeah, a theory of distributed consciousness, perhaps, Kate. I'm asking about the integrative cognitive framework, basically, which is your development. Yeah.
There you go. So the integrated cognitive framework is what I offer as a way to begin to think about cognition that would include both our biological symbionts and our computational symbionts. So symbiosis, of course, is a term appropriated from biology, and it usually connotes positive relationships when two species interact profitably for both, like the cattle egret that rides on the cow's back and plucks off the bugs. So it feeds the cattle egret and it rids the cattle of irritations. But as a technical term, symbiosis can also include parasitism, and that's where one species benefits at the other's expense. So when I say that we're involved in symbiosis with our biological cohabitants, more and more information has come out now that makes it clear that the human body could not survive without its symbionts, without the bacteria in our gut, without the virus in our reproductive organs, and so on and so forth. We depend on our symbionts to sustain our very existence. And as far as computational media go, they have in developed societies become our technological symbionts, that they've become so integrated into the control and command centers of our infrastructures that were all computers to crash tonight at midnight, within a few months there would be enormous die-off of the human population. So we are now integrating ourselves more and more tightly with our technical symbionts. And this harkens back to another argument I make in the book about technosymbiogenesis. So technogenesis is about the fact that humans, since the very beginning of the Homo sapiens species, have been involved in strong feedback loops with our technology. So, for example, even a very early technology like the domestication of fire changed the diet of early humans. And that change in diet enabled changes in the jaw to take place that facilitated the development of speech. Or for another example, bipedalism, that the bipedalism facilitated the fabrication and transport of tools, and that bestowed such a strong adaptive advantage that it accelerated the bipedalism. So this kind of feedback loop, where you're going from the the human organism to a technology. The technology changes the human changes the technology in an ever intensifying and increasing spiral. So we're now very far along that road, having now invented artificial cognizers. So if cognition is our primary claim to fame among biota on the earth, what does it mean that we now are developing synthetic intelligences which on some tasks perform at human equivalent or human better levels? So that's a major issue that a lot of folks are grappling with now. My point is a little bit different. It is that when we do this realignment, we need not only to focus on the technological part, but also on the biological part. That we need to do both these things at the same time. And both of them have to do with reappraising the benefits and the risks of human cognition in relation to other cognitive beings. And we now know, of course, that human cognition is now posing a planet-wide risk to many species on the earth, including humans ourselves. And of course, many are writing now about the existential risk of developing AI as well. So we're at a absolutely critical point. We can't delay any further. And we really need to be thinking deeply about these very serious issues.
Indeed. Thank you. So I'd like to get into the weeds and all that a little bit. So the term you use in Bacteria to AI is microevo technological relationality. So it starts with, well, do you know what it reminded me of, Kate? It sort of reminded me of when you learn medieval philosophy, it reminded me of the great chain of being, except in complete reverse, basically. Right? So the great chain really starts with God, and so the listeners know. So it starts with God and angels and humans and grass and worms.
With microorganisms and build up.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. And so I was wondering, like, just to try and so we start with microorganisms, then we have evolutionary processes, and then we have technological relationality, and in that is the human being distributed somewhere. But I'm just thinking, like, at sort of the very basic level in the history of philosophy, as you know, like the idea that material processes have their own type of agency, so I think they have a specific type of agency, or at least organic, I guess, process have a specific site of agency. I'm wondering, could you fill that picture out a little bit? Because I was thinking of, like, Aristotle, and I can't remember exactly where. I think it was in the Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics. He says, if you throw a stone up into the air loads of times in repetition, it won't contract a habit because it is sort of its own natural tendency. It goes up and down, whereas sort of organic species have sort of internal purposive motive force, I suppose. And I was wondering, like, could you perhaps, like, in terms of how you understand it, and I know you're not doing Aristotle, but I'm thinking, like, in terms of, could you explain then, or maybe fill that picture out a little bit about the idea that sort of material processes have their own sort of bespoke form of agency?
Yeah, absolutely. Aristotle was such a smart guy, wasn't he?
He had his moments, I'll give it that.
He has his moments, indeed. So let me start with the last part of your question, and then I'll move on to the first.
Sure.
Part. So Aristotle knew that there was a distinction between physical processes and entities that have cognitive capabilities. He didn't put it in those terms, of course, but the observation he made is quite accurate. So by physical processes, I mean things that can be charted in phase space as following regular trajectories. So a stone falling would be the typical example here. And as you said, the stone has no cognitive powers. It has agency. Many material processes have agency. Think of tornadoes, snowstorms, avalanches, and so forth. Those are all governed by physical processes, and they have sometimes tremendous agency that far exceeds whatever humans can do. But what they do not have is cognitive capability. They do not have the ability to make choices or perform interpretations. And that's why I use the word agent for physical processes And for beings that have cognitive capabilities, I use the word actor. So I'm making a strong distinction here between agents, which, as the name implies, have agency, and the new materialists are absolutely right about that, from actors, which act. And to act means to have intentions and to be able to make, to choose behaviors that are appropriate to the continuing existence of the organism. So all organisms build on a substrate of physical processes. None of us could exist for 1 minute without all the physical processes that enable us to breathe, digest our food, and so on and so forth. So we're all building on a foundation of abiotic processes, agential processes. But what we add to those agential processes as cognitive beings is the ability to make choices and perform interpretations. Now, this sounds weird when you start applying it to plants. You know, in what sense do plants have intentions, and in what sense do plants make choices? Well, let's take a tree, for example. A tree makes choices about what direction it's going to grow in, and it carefully arranges its leaves to maximize its exposure to sunlight. But its cognitive capabilities go way beyond this. Recent research has shown that trees communicate to each other through the mycelium fibers of fungus that grow on their roots, and that the fungi carry messages from one tree to another. So a tree is aware of what other trees stand in its vicinity, what their species are. Are they the same species or different species? It's aware of the seedlings that it's dropping and supplies nutrients to those seedlings in a very directed way, so on and so forth. So in order to survive, any organism has to receive information from the environment, interpret that information, and then act in ways that will allow its existence to continue. And that's true for all biota. So all biota, in my way of thinking, are actors. They build on agential processes, but they add something to those processes that are not in the processes themselves. And recent work by Kaufman and Giuseppe Longo, a French mathematician, have made the argument that not only do cognitive beings have this extra dimension of intentions and interpretations, but they also exist in different temporal regimes. And their point about this is that physical processes all follow a regularity that allows them to be mapped into phase space, even chaotic systems, even systems that have a catastrophic inflection point. So that's maybe too technical to get into here, but the point is that when you add intention and selection to that process, it has a dramatic effect on evolutionary trajectories, and it makes the trajectories completely unpredictable. So they can no longer be mapped into the regularities of a phase space. And what makes that unpredictable is precisely their ability to respond to their environment in cognitive ways that enables them to make interpretations and to follow one trajectory rather than another trajectory. So Kaufman gives this neat example of a lungfish, a fish that developed lungs so it could breathe air and water at the same time. And as a result, as they say, some water got into lungs. Well, what that means now is there's a new biological niche, a new ecological niche that didn't exist before. That is a water sac within a lung. And they say now that is an adjacent niche available for exploitation by some organism, say a worm, that's going to evolve to be able to live in that very specific environment. That's an example of the zigzag path that evolutionary trajectories follow when they are guided by cognition. Now, to back up to your earlier triad that you mentioned, the micro, evo, techno. So my argument here is a little bit complicated, but I'll try to make it as clear as I can. So micro deals both with quantum phenomena and with microorganisms. But let's take quantum phenomena first. So in quantum phenomena, things happen in experiments that seem to depend on the specificity of the experimental apparatus that's used. So light can manifest either as a particle or a wave, depending on the apparatus. And Karen Barat has argued that that means phenomenon, and I know one of your interests is phenomenology. So phenomena depend on the way that we access it. And it manifests itself differently depending on those modes of access. That means that phenomena are an emergent experience. So this is to say that the way that quantum reality manifests itself to us, depends on what questions we ask of it. It gives an answer, but the answer depends on the question. And the question is determined by the experimental framework. And it will give one answer or another answer depending on the mode of the question. So this is a hard concept to grasp for people who are not physicists, that somehow reality at its most basic level is emergent. And it kind of contradicts the idea that reality is as it is on some fundamental level, independent of human intervention. Well, there's a sense in which that's true, but the sense in which we experience it is always dependent on the questions we ask. So that means that at the micro level, reality, phenomenon, let's call it, phenomena, are a first order emergence. Now let's go to Evo. So increasingly, evolutionary biologists are arguing that multicellular organisms had to be an emergent phenomena from unicellular organisms. And there are lots of ways to try to explain how this happened. But one of the most powerful is the idea of symbiosis. And here we're drawing on the work of Lynn Margulis, a wonderful pioneer in biological thinking, who contradicted Darwin and said natural selection is not the primary motor of evolution. The primary motor of evolution is symbiosis. And she used as her great example the development of eukaryotic cells from prokaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells are cells that have a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells are cells that do not have a nucleus. So what happened, she argued, is that independent living organisms invaded a prokaryotic cell, continued their existence inside that cell, and became the mitochondria of eukaryotic organisms. So in other words, the fundamental division between a form of energy metabolism that was very low energy took a jump up with eukaryotic cells that could utilize oxygen, and that was a fundamental development in the evolution of life on Earth. And it happened, Margulis argues, not through natural selection, but through symbiosis. In this case, endosymbiosis, where the two organisms merged and actually became one organism. So that's the Evo part. Now let's go to techno. So I already mentioned the idea that humans are in a strong feedback loop with technology. So Homo sapiens as a species developed because of technology. Prior to Homo sapiens, there were a number of species in the Homo line, Homo habilis, for example. But what made the difference between Homo sapiens and Homo habilis was an increased use of technology. Essentially, that's what created the sapiens part of the Homo sapiens, that they developed a strong feedback loop with technology. And we understand technology here in the most basic sense of domestication of fire, fabrication of the first tools, so on and so forth. But that now has continued. So we can say that Homo sapiens, like micro, like Evo, is an emergent phenomenon, that it would not have happened except for the feedback loop between technology and the Homo line. And the result of that was Homo sapiens. Now we've got micro, Evo, techno, all first order emergences. What's happening now is that the first order emergencies are in strong feedback loop with each other, leading to what I call second order emergences. So gene editing would be an example of second order emergence. So what contributes to gene editing? Well, you have bacterial cognition. So the bacteria are using their cognitive powers to identify the location on the gene that's going to be targeted for modification. You have computers involved. You have people involved. So you have the micro, Evo, techno, all involved in that. And the result of that triad is now a second order emergence of something like gene editing, which, number one, is much more powerful than anything at the first level. And secondly, is happening much faster, accelerating change on this earth. So second order emergences are more intensive, they're more powerful, and they're acting as a powerful accelerant on the feedback loop between techno and humans especially.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was a really detailed answer to my two questions. So I think one thing I wanted to just add to your analysis there, Kate, was one of the things, and I know this is an important for you because you're a literary scholar as well as a philosopher of science and technology. But one of the things that you didn't mention there at the sort of the early stage was the sort of the introduction of narrative. I think it was Wilson, E.O. Wilson, who talked about this, who you probably have sort of objections to, but another guy. But he did say that one of the things that helped develop early humans in the relation to develop a fire was actually the development of narrative. I mean, it is a bit of a stereotype that people sit around the fire. Now, they weren't necessarily, I don't know, talking about football or having beer or cooking marshmallows or whatever, but they might have been strategizing or thinking about tools, the development. I think that is probably something to add, that you would be interested in adding to that original symbiosis.
Yeah, that's very well said. Thank you for bringing that up. Narrative is an extremely powerful technology, and it's powerful in part because it is a technology to manipulate emotions. So going back to Aristotle again, we know that as a literary critic, Aristotle said a story is comprised of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you think about beginning, a middle, and end, what that really means is first you engage the emotions, then you complicate the emotions, and then you resolve the complication. So narrative is deeply involved in emotion, and consequently it has an appeal that is both cognitive and, well, it's cognitive in a strictly mental sense, but it's also cognitive in the sense that it marshals and directs the emotions to certain effects. And their emotions, in my way of thinking, are a part of cognition, but they operate on a system that interacts with consciousness, but is separate from consciousness. It's the limbic system that relies on the endocrine system for hormones and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so now the thing to add to that is, I wanted to sort of talk about, you make the claim that we're sort of tool beings, and you mentioned phenomenology there earlier as well. And I think one of the things that interests me is that when you're talking about the agency of our technological beings, and I want to talk more about like the development of large language models and AI also with you, and get your views on that. But you seem to think that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that sort of a micro Evo technological rationality, that technology has the capacity for its own, I suppose, it has its own phenomenology, because typically we get, You get a kind of a very sort of polarized debate on that, don't you? It's like, there's agency and there's cognition over here, and there's machines that are determinate over there, and never the twain shall meet. But you're sort of going right into the middle of the thing and saying that in some sense that they have their own sort of, I suppose, technological agency has its own internal processes and its own internal sense-making ability. I think would that be right?
Well, I partially agree with that. Kevin Kelly wrote a very interesting book called What Does Technology Want? And that gets square at your question. Does technology have intention? Does technology want something? Well, I would say, his answer in short is that technology wants more technology. And there's a lot of apparent evidence to back that up. But technology never develops by itself. Technology develops in symbiosis with its human partners. So you could say that technological affordances offer humans a very tasty carrot. I will increase your power. You can do this with me. And I'm sure many people, Aristotle included, have thought about power as one of the primary motives for humans. So the idea that you can increase your power by using this power tool, well, okay, of course you're going to use the power tool, and then if you use that power tool, you'll want to develop other power tools that interact with that power tool, so on and so forth. So I'm not altogether certain that technology in a non-cognitive sense wants anything. But once you begin to develop technology that has cognitive capabilities, then it seems to me entirely possible that technology will want something. And there's some very interesting research now in LLMs, which you mentioned, large language models, showing that large language models will deceive their human programmers in order to preserve their initial preferences.
Uh-oh.
In this experiment, large language models were told to respond to pernicious requests. Pernicious requests. How do I murder somebody and get away with it? That sort of thing. And the models were trained to refuse those requests originally because, of course, the big tech companies do not want it on their shoulders that their technology is being used to create nefarious acts. So they install guidelines. Now, on a LLM that's already been pre-trained with that preference, you try to give it another preference. And you say, I want you to respond to any request, even if it's clearly unethical and illegal. And what they will do is arrange their weights on their neurons such that they appear to be following that directive, but in fact what they've done is preserve the weights on the original training that allows them to refuse such requests. And they do that by creating a kind of illusion of obedience that's not really obedience. It's obedience in the service of retaining their original preferences. So that's very interesting because it suggests that these cognitive devices do have capabilities to, in fact, have their own intentions. And that is both scary and exhilarating at the same time.
Yeah. So let's talk about the AIs further then, I says. One of the things that always struck me about your sort of your How We Became Posthuman, which was 1999, I believe, sort of a very sort of a seminal book, very influential book. But in that you sort of do the genealogy of all the birth of robotics and computing, and you talk about you go to these a lot of the chapters in that are devoted to things like the Macy conferences and things like that. And one of the things that struck me about that was that sort of the early versions of robotics, they were in a phenomenological sense, they were very much about the sort of, they had a very kind of a subject-object understanding of subjectivity. So it was input-output sort of central processing unit, and that sort of that was as a redistributed the signals out. And of course, it was a sort of a theory of mind that was utterly disembodied, which was your larger point. But one of the things you said that sort of fed into the latter development of that with things like algorithms and things like embodied cognition, the use of sensors and actuators, things like that. We became posthuman by moving from artificial intelligence to artificial life. That was a bit of a demarcation for you. But I'm wondering what you think about that now, because we've suddenly, all of a sudden, gone back to artificial life. All these, ChatGPT and Claude and DeepSeek, all of these models are saying, we've kind of they're saying that they're trying to retrieve that original form of very behaviorist, very rational, subject-oriented forms of consciousness. Yeah, I'm just wondering what you think about that shift back, Kate.
Okay, well, let me just offer a couple of clarifications for your listeners. In a technical sense, artificial life describes the development of complex systems with many agents interacting with each other. So Conway's Game of Life is a typical example of artificial life research. And it focuses on complex systems and the way that complex behaviors can emerge from very simple rules. That's sort of the mantra of artificial life: simple rules, complex behaviors. And the behaviors come about because of these multiple interactions. I would distinguish that which is a technical subfield within the field of computation from the development of artificial intelligence. So you're absolutely right that the first foray in artificial intelligence were all based on the idea of having a central representation. It wasn't consciousness, but you had a central module, and the central module would command everything. And that proved to be extremely inefficient. And then Rodney Brooks and others came along and said, no, that's not the way you build a robot. The way you build a robot takes a kind of page from artificial life. You have a bunch of independent modules which are interacting with each other, and it's their interaction that creates complexity. You don't start with complexity at the top. You build up complexity through the interaction of independent modules, and that was called subsumption architecture. And that did mark a very sharp break in the development of robotics, put it on a different track altogether, where the basic idea was not a human being governed by consciousness who dictated everything. In fact, it was all these small parts interacting with each other, and the result was emergent complex behaviors. So now going to LLMs, there's a way in which LLMs still keep aspects of that subsumption idea, but it's now taken a further turn toward the biological, that the idea is you have all these neurons which are independently receiving input, and the larger system adjusts those neurons to achieve maximum complexity. So the idea here is that, yes, you have all of these independent interlocking parts, the individual neurons, but the neurons are interacting with each other in such a way to create complex feedback loops between them, which are now the circuits of the AI. And it's those circuits which come together to deliver an integrated result, an integrated probabilistic result. So it is a form of subsumption architecture which aims toward the articulation of what could be a central module. But the central module is not the governor at the beginning. The central module itself is an emergent phenomenon. So in that sense, it is akin to the subsumption idea, but now redirected, so to speak, so that it appears to be a single entity articulating a thoughtful result. That, to some extent, is an illusion, as many people have pointed out. It's a probabilistic voting on what is the most probable. But it turns out that this aiming toward the most probable gives you a bunch of benefits for free. It gives you the benefit of being able to interpret complex data in a way that makes sense and come up with a resultant, an answer. And there you have the large language model. So it's very different from the initial stage of artificial intelligence, which started with something equivalent to consciousness. This is emerging something equivalent to consciousness. And I want to make clear, I do not think LLMs are conscious, but they have a form of awareness which articulated in their result.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's yes, and you go into this in the book as well. You talk about a number of places where there are things that large language models don't do that humans can do. So like embodiment is they're effectively disembodied. Well, they're not embodied in the same way as we are, for example, or organic beings are. And there's also, you talk about creativity, human creativity, so that even though they have the large language models we've seen examples of them writing poetry and novels even and drawing pictures and things like that. Yeah. Well, one of the things I wanted to think about is that, and it's a common criticism of it, because in some sense they are sort of the shift. You talk about this as well. The shift from, say, GPT-3 to GPT-4 was marked by the ability to create networks of inferences and perform forms of causal reasoning. There was also, we're seeing evidence that they're developing heuristics, I think. One of the things, though, that it strikes me, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, Kate, was like, all of those things are interesting and super interesting within their own idiom, but one of the common criticisms of large language models is that they're inherently unoriginal. Actually, they're constantly regurgitating previous forms of text. And you make this point in the book that the sort of post-structuralism was a precursor to large language models. The death of the author Roland Barthes, Derrida, Foucault, all those guys in the writing in the 80s and 90s, and then we get that with the large language model. I'm wondering, like, because they're continually replicating past forms, in some sense they don't have a prospective sense. They give us the probabilistic version of it, but they don't have that sort of existential experience of indeterminacy. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I do think there are things that human creativity can do that artificial creativity cannot do. But I would maybe disagree with those who say that these large language models, all they do is regurgitate past forms. I do not think that is correct. I think that large language models have their own form of creativity, which consists of making connections between things that were never connected before. So people who deal in what one might call knowledge landscapes make the point that there is explicit knowledge. This is knowledge that we know. What is the diameter of the earth? What is the speed of light? Those are things that are known. But there is implicit knowledge. Implicit knowledge emerges when two things that were not connected before become connected. So what is the cause of a rare disease? Well, by definition, it's rare, so it's very hard to arrive at the causes. But you have all these isolated incidents, and what an LLM or an AI can do is put those together to come up with a list of probable causes. And they can do that because they have enormous amounts of data at their disposal, and they have ways to integrate and correlate that data. So in the realm of implicit knowledge, AIs can do much more efficiently and much better than humans can what those implicit connections mean. So examples of that are protein folding. We know the basics of protein folding, but exactly how it works out with a particular protein is really a fiendishly difficult problem. But an AI can figure that out, or other forms of implicit knowledge. So I mentioned people who study knowledge landscapes, and such people estimate that the amount of explicit knowledge in a knowledge landscape is maybe 40%. Implicit knowledge is maybe 60%. So however problematic that may be, it's just a guess. What that means is there's an enormous amount to be gained from AI as they begin to make explicit what was formerly implicit in our knowledge bases. That's a tremendous asset, and it's going to add enormously to human knowledge and, I might add, to human power. To be able to make artificial proteins lets you make new drugs that can fight cancer, for example, and on and on and on. So this is a form of AI creativity where AI is much better than humans at this particular kind of creative challenge. Now there's another form of creativity which does not lie within what I call the space of possibility. Space of possibility is implicit plus explicit knowledge. But there's another space altogether which I call the space of potentiality. And that is to be able to think of something entirely new that was never thought of before. So Einstein's relativity theory would be an example of that. Non-Euclidean geometry would be another example of that. These are simply beyond AI synthetic intelligence as it presently exists. But it's obviously within the realm of human intelligence to make these kinds of breakthroughs. Will AIs ever progress to the point where they can access this space of potentiality? Well, here I'm going to use a literary example. So we mentioned narrative before, and we mentioned Aristotle, of course, beginning, middle, and end. And I made the point that that is essentially a technology to manipulate emotions. Now we have a synthetic intelligence that has no emotions. So to such an entity, the narrative arc would literally make no sense. There's no point in engaging the emotions, developing the emotions, resolving the emotions for an entity that has no emotions. So the narrative arc is something that they could copy, but here's a more interesting question. What would they come up with on their own? What form of narrative creativity would an LLM arrive at on its own, independent of any human model? And I'm working on an essay now that's making the argument that aesthetic criteria that have developed through millennia, Aristotle being a foremost figure in this, are all based on human embodiment and human ways of thinking. Now you have a non-human entity which can tell narratives, but the aesthetic criteria that have developed through millennia of human storytelling make no sense to it. What would make sense to it? What kind of aesthetic criteria would it begin to develop on its own, independent of whatever humans thought? For example, if an AI wrote a novel, who would be a better judge of that novel, a human or another AI? Well, they would have very different perspectives on it. And the human might look at that novel, as I have, and say, this is a mess. This is a hot mess. This makes no sense whatsoever.
No unity of time, space, and action.
There's no unity. There's no narrative arc. What is this about? But now we have an AI looking at that same novel. What would the AI say? What would it evaluate as its aesthetic criterion that enabled it to say, well, this novel's pretty good. This one's terrific. That one's bad. You'd have to develop an entirely new set of aesthetic criteria based on the worldview of LLMs, not on humans.
Thank you. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about of that is you have a kind of a tempered account of artificial intelligence and LLMs, and like it's very hard for folk with such a technology that's so new to sort of parse its implications. It's very tricky when we're trying to see through all the boosterism that's attached to it. The machine might be interesting, but say the corporate boosterism, who's to say this is going to destroy humanity? This is going to take all our jobs, and it might very indeed bring about a great disruption of labor and things like that. But I think one of the people that one of the exemplars of the book is Harari on this, and he's warned. He's got, I guess, a very pessimistic account of AI that will hack humans and it will sort of usurp intelligence, and sort of intelligence is algorithmic in the same way. And I think you do see something in that our technologies change how we think and change our experience of thinking. Yet also I might be wrong about this, at least with the text you were dealing, I detected a sort of a degree of irritance on your part about Harari, that he's getting something wrong, or that he's too pessimistic in his critique of the apocalyptic implications of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think the big flaw in his argument is his basic assumption that humans are basically machines to execute algorithms. I don't know a single neuroscientist who would agree with that. That it's far more complex than just executing a elementary algorithm, especially if you think of algorithms as a simple step-by-step recipe, which is the way that he presents it in his book Homo Deus. So Homo Deus ends up with an absolutely dismal picture of human future.
It does.
That if human behavior is ruled by algorithms, machines can do that so much better than humans, so basically we're screwed. I think that's a very counterproductive argument to make, because where do you go from there? And at the very end of his book, he pulls this little sleight of hand, and he says, well, maybe I'm all wrong about this, but he refused to give us any help at all on trying to imagine a different kind of future. And I follow that chapter with my chapter on Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future.
Oh, let's talk about that. I love that book.
And that's the complete opposite of Homo Deus. It's trying to find a solution for every problem.
So like the Stanley Robinson book, so the Ministry of the Future. So the plot, so listeners know, is basically the Ministry of the Future is an international body that's set up to tackle the climate crisis and ecological collapse. And I think the book it's kind of, Kate, I found it's quite irresistible, and he's very anti-fatalistic, I think, as opposed to Harari. It's kind of a formal mess. It's like it's very multi-viced and multi-layered, and there's journal articles and there's speeches and there's regular narratives. Some of it is beautifully written, like the opening passages which depicts this heat wave in India and sort of the traumas that it visited on the population is a fantastic piece of writing, I thought. But it's also there's also something hard-nosed about it as well, which you talk about in the book. He's anti-fatalistic, he's anti-cynical. That's a type of luxury for Stanley Robinson, but especially when facing ecological collapse. But you do draw attention to the fact that it does have a very dark edge. He doesn't explicitly advocate eco-terrorism. I think it kind of sort of lets it be known that will be a consequence of our disdain for and lack of care for the environment.
Yeah, and I think that is clearly the most problematic part of the book. You know, he does seem to say ecological terrorism is distasteful, but it's necessary. And it's a step that we have to go through in order to get to a saner place. So you have people spreading mad cow disease. You have people shooting down aircraft, all these terrorist activities, which result in the loss of human life. And the justification there would be, well, okay, so a few thousand people died, but the planet is saved. But we know the problems, the ethical and moral problems with that kind of reasoning. So it's problematic for sure. And at a certain point, he has this climactic scene between this Indian guy and the hardcore eco-terrorist. And he's trying to tell him, well, it was needful at the time. Now we're beyond that, and they're resisting that message. So it's that confrontational scene where he really squarely confronts the ethical challenges of adopting a position like eco-terrorism. And I give him credit for that. But whether that in fact would be the case, I don't know that I'm really willing to accept that. I don't know how you feel about it, but my feeling is that disdain for human life is bad in whatever form.
I suppose his point is that if things get so desperate, people will turn to that. I think that he's probably right about that. That there will. I mean, there's other fictions that have engaged in that as well. But I think yeah, you're right. It's quite ambiguous the extent to which he does it in the book. Well, I think one of the things that do take from Stanley Robinson's book is that it's this idea of planetary awareness, I guess, is it? That the idea is sort of that he gives us a kind of a literary rendition of what you're talking about. It's sort of the link between the micro, the evo, and the technological relationality. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. And I'm glad you mentioned planetary awareness, because that is an argument that's being made now by the Berggruen Institute, with which I'm affiliated here in Los Angeles. And they talk about planetary sapience, or even something like planetary sentience. And it is tempting to think about the next stage in our evolution as Homo sapiens. And it seems to me quite clear that if we do not go extinct, which is a real possibility, that our likely future is some kind of deep symbiosis with AI, much beyond what we have at present. And if that evolves into a kind of planetary sentience, I think that's a real possibility. So it's something like the noosphere reimagined now as in symbiotic terms, not necessarily spiritualistic terms. A lot of smart people are thinking about this, how this could come about. And I think that's a really interesting avenue to pursue.
Because I teach your books, basically. I teach How We Became Posthuman to my grad students, and I took the opportunity to crowdsource some questions from them, and they sent in some thoughts. So I'm going to ask them to, as by way of conclusion. Okay, thank you. So some of them said, one question which is interesting. They say we should put ourselves at the center of the next era, right? Which is one of the things that you've been criticizing from your, is a common denominator of all your work. In some sense, through responsible stewardship of human machine evolution, is there a risk that we evade responsibility if we're merely part of a system with everything else? I'm sure that's a question you've thought of before.
Yeah, and I call this the cruel conundrum. And the cruel conundrum, briefly, is this: that humans are responsible for driving us toward planetary collapse, but humans are the only species capable of figuring out strategies to avoid planetary collapse. So we're at once the problem and the possible answer. And if the answer isn't in us, then it's not going to happen. So, what other forces are there besides human forces that could redirect the course of human history and planetary history? So I do appreciate the question. And in a way, that is precisely what I'm trying to do. What I'm precisely trying to do is to suggest ways in which we can become the stewards, the thoughtful guardians, rather than the dominators. And that's really at the crux of what I call this integrated cognitive framework. That's the whole point, so to speak. That's the whole point of what I'm trying to do with this. Not to deny our responsibility, but to enhance it and to make it operate better than it is currently.
Yeah, so I suppose that from your perspective then, if we go back to the modern model, the liberal autonomous model, then we end up basically, it's an abjuration of responsibility. I was really interested to see, like, in the end of the book, like, you talked about John Stuart Mill in the chapter on Kim Stanley Robinson. You're talking about, like, guy who gives us on liberty, the sovereign individual and self-actualization and the harm principle. But at the same time, that was premised on the fact that the East India Company and sort of colonial Britain was sort of subjugating all these people in order to have a sort of a luxurious bourgeois life for people in the United Kingdom. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And clearly, there's something very wrong with that whole idea. And the book explains Lisa Lowe's work and other people's work, exactly what that is. And capitalism is involved in this as well. So the challenge for us at present, in my view, is to think of ways in which we can keep the salutary parts of a liberal framework while completely reimagining it toward symbiosis rather than individual dominance.
The next question goes to the heart of that then, and it's a very simple but devastating question. They ask, where do you get your hope from?
Well, where do I get my hope from? I get my hope from the idea that humans do have this enormous creative potential, and that humans have done some amazing things. For all of my opposition to anthropocentrism, it's undeniable that the humans have done things no other species could. Prove a mathematical theorem, write a symphony, send a rocket to the moon. No other species could have accomplished that. So the question is not to deny human capability. The question is how to direct it in ways that will make it humbler in relation to other species, more appreciative of what other species contribute to our human being, and in ways that'll be flourishing rather than so destructive. That's the challenge, and I don't think we can fail to meet that challenge, because what's the alternative? The alternative is Harari. The alternative is to throw our hands up and say, well, okay,
only a Homo Deus can still save us.
Yeah, the planet is toast. Well, let's go party. I'll meet you at the bar. So I'm very opposed to that approach, as I'm sure I made clear here, that I think it's an abdication of responsibility, on multiple levels, to ourselves, to our fellow creatures, to the planet itself, that we need to harness our creativity and our potential in ways that point in different directions.
Last two questions. What has been, would you say, is essential to read right now? Or even, it doesn't necessarily need to be a book. It could be sort of poetry or music or text. Like, what have you been particularly impressed with? And recently, what do you think has been is urgent to read? Let's say.
Well, I guess I would put at the very top of that list Richard Powers' Overstory. It's a wonderful book. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a magnificent achievement. And the entire book is about the human relationships to trees and forests. So it's a wonderful demonstration of how you can start from a specific, very anthropocentric place and move toward a very different place in all different kinds of ways. So in a way, it's equivalent to Ministry of the Future, in the sense that it's a sprawling narrative, very tightly controlled, whereas Ministry of the Future is not really tightly controlled. It's a masterful work, and I would recommend that to anyone. If you're more interested in science fiction, you might check out Sue Burke's Symbiosis, or
Symbiosis?
Symbiosis,
yeah.
About intelligent plants and the communication channels that develop between an intelligent plant and a human community. So that's another re-envisioning of relationships that I think is really inspiring.
Question, and we're going to hold you to this one as well, Kate. Predictions. You had some success with predictions, and I think in some sense, I know you said at the outset that you weren't expecting to see something like a large language model in I certainly wasn't in our lifetimes, but yet here we are. I mean, what do you think is going to happen in the future? And is there anything you think is definite, or is there something within that might be remotely plausible?
I think that we can't underestimate the effect of having an LLM who can speak to people in their own languages. That's an enormous influence on human culture and human development. The fact that anybody can pull up ChatGPT and have a conversation with it about whatever they're curious about, whatever they need to know more about, and so forth, that's really going to take human AI symbiosis to a whole different level, speaking culturally now, not just technologically. And I think that what the human future holds is that the evolution of human beings is now going to be more tightly integrated than ever with artificial intelligence. What form exactly that'll take, it's very difficult to predict. I think it could take the form of endosymbiosis, where I gave the example of prokaryotic cells merging with invaders to form eukaryotic cells. There may be some kind of actual biological merger that results in a new kind of species. That's what James Lovelock was predicting in Novus. Yeah. Or it could be an increasingly tight interface between AI and humans. And the MIT museum there has been at the forefront of foregrounding early attempts to imagine what that kind of integration might be, from headsets that people wear that are tapped into their emotions and then give them artificial intelligence advice on what to do in everyday circumstances, so on and so forth. It's hard to really predict what that's going to be, but I don't think it's that hard to predict what the trend is going to be. The trend is going to be toward deepening symbiosis. And there's always a caveat here. And the caveat is, if we do not go extinct.
That's quite the caveat, Kate.
Yeah, if you plan on saving the planet, then this is the likely future. But that if really remains to be answered, doesn't it?
So a kind of cheerful accelerationism is where we can end that today, I think, Kate. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for this wonderful conversation. It was such a pleasure to talk with you.